On a heavy, breathless morning in August 1855, a child stood on the auction block in Savannah, Georgia. The air shimmered with heat, and even the flies seemed sluggish. Yet no one in the crowd stepped forward. No one wanted him. His pallid skin and colorless eyes marked him as something unnatural, cursed, dangerous, a child that whispered of bad luck and death. The bidding began at $20, then dropped to $15, then $10. When it fell to $5, the auctioneer's voice cracked with embarrassment. Only then did a single fan rise above the crowd. It belonged to Margaret Dunor, a widow who owned more than 4,000 acres of coastal land 12 miles outside the city. She offered $12, calling it an act of Christian mercy. The crowd murmured approvingly, grateful that someone had shown compassion for a creature best forgotten. What they didn't know was that Margaret had been searching for a child like this one for 3 years. What they could never have imagined was that over the next 14 years, 73 people would vanish from her property. Disappearances quietly ignored, their names eventually erased from county records. Officially, the ledgers that documented their fates were said to have been destroyed when Confederate troops burned county archives in 1861. But one ledger survived, hidden inside a foundation wall, unearthed more than a century later during highway construction in 1959. Inside were pages of precise measurements, bloodline charts, and something referred to only as the Purification Project. Before we continue with the story of the albino boy and the compound Margaret built in the swamps beyond her fields, I need to ask you something. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We bring you the buried histories others tried to erase. And tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We want to know how far these forgotten stories travel. Now let's return to that sweltering August afternoon, the moment when one widow's dark vision began to take form. The heat in Savannah that day was suffocating, a wet blanket pressing down on the auction yard near the waterfront. Margaret Dunor arrived alone in her carriage as she always did. She was an imposing figure, large, commanding, and unbothered by the whispers her presence inspired. At 47, she had managed her late husband's plantation for over a decade with a will so cold and precise it made even her overseers uneasy. Yet what truly set Margaret apart was not her authority, but her curiosity. In her private library, she had gathered more than 300 volumes on natural philosophy, anatomy, and animal breeding. Her shelves overflowed with European treatises on heredity and hybridization, ideas that blurred the line between science and obsession. The boy brought to the platform that morning was perhaps 11 years old, frail enough that his ribs showed through his linen shirt. But it was his coloring that drew a hush from the crowd. His skin seemed translucent, his hair nearly white, and his eyes, pale gray with a hint of rose, seemed to look through people, not at them. The auctioneer, Cyrus Peaton, cleared his throat uneasily. "Lot 47. He called out, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Male child approximately 11 years from the Hutchinson estate near Augusta. As you can see, he bears a particular condition. The word albinism was not spoken. It didn't have to be. In 1855 Georgia, such a child carried an aura of fear. Some said they could see the dead. Others whispered they brought crop failures, storms, or death to those who kept them. Both the enslaved and the free saw them as omens, a living challenge to the rigid racial order upon which the South depended. When Peaton opened the bidding at $20, no one moved. At 15, silence. Heads turned away. At 5, finally a fan lifted, a signal that sealed one boy's fate and began one of the darkest chapters in Georgia's forgotten history. Still nothing. People turned away, some making signs against evil. That was when Margaret raised her fan with deliberate slowness, her expression serene. The crowd turned to stare. 5 to Mrs. Dunor. Peaton said quickly, relieved to have any bid. Going once, going twice, sold. Margaret stood, opening her purse with theatrical generosity. "I will pay her 12 for the poor child," she announced loudly. "It is our Christian duty to care for those whom others reject." Several women nodded approvingly. An elderly gentleman called out, "God bless you, Mrs. Dunor." She acknowledged the praise with a gracious smile, the very picture of benevolent Christianity. But as the boy was led to her carriage, her eyes studied him with the cold calculation of a naturalist examining a rare specimen. She had finally found what she needed. Subject 0 for her purification project, the boy whose previous owners had called him Thomas sat pressed into the corner of the carriage during the journey to Belmont Plantation. Margaret said nothing to him, but she opened a leather journal and began writing observations: his approximate age, the specific shade of his skin and hair, the color of his eyes in different light, the size of his hands and feet. She worked methodically, occasionally looking up to measure him with her gaze before returning to her notes. Augustus, Margaret's driver, had worked for the Dunor family for over 20 years. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. He had learned long ago not to question what Margaret did. Belmont had a reputation among the enslaved community in Chatham County. People went there and simply vanished, not escaped, because word usually spread about runaways being captured. These people ceased to exist as if they had never been born. The carriage rolled through pine forest toward a part of Belmont that Thomas would soon know too well. A collection of buildings hidden nearly a mile from the main house, accessible only by a narrow road through thick woods. These structures had been built between 1843 and 1852 using materials purchased in small quantities from different suppliers across 3 states. The workers who constructed them had been sold immediately after completion, dispersed to plantations so far apart they would never meet to compare stories. When Augustus stopped the carriage in front of the largest building, Margaret climbed down and beckoned Thomas to follow. The interior was unlike anything he had ever seen. Clean pine floors, whitewashed walls, glass windows. Margaret led him to a small room containing a bed with an actual mattress, a chair, a table with a basin and a shelf. "This will be your room," she said, her cultured voice carrying no warmth. "You will be provided with adequate food, clothing, and shelter. In return, you will cooperate with certain procedures, medical examinations, measurements, observations. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded, understanding nothing except that survival meant obedience. "Can you read?" He shook his head. "Can you write?" Another shake. "You will be taught," Margaret said with satisfaction. "You will learn to read, write, and understand natural philosophy. These lessons begin tomorrow. You may ask questions about your lessons, but you will not ask questions about anything else you see or hear. You will not speak to others without permission. You will not attempt to leave. If you obey, you will be treated well. If you disobey, punishments will be severe. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded again, his thin body trembling. Margaret locked the door from the outside when she left. Thomas stood motionless for a long time before finally sitting on the edge of the mattress. He could not lie down. Instead, he sat with his back against the wall, knees drawn to his chest, waiting for whatever would come next. In the cool basement of another building, Margaret lit oil lamps and opened a journal. She dipped her pen in ink and began writing in neat, precise script. August 17, 1855. Subject 0 has arrived at Belmont. Initial observations suggest excellent quality for the purification project. Pure albinism evident in all physical characteristics. Begin preliminary measurements tomorrow, followed by educational assessment. Subject 0 represents the foundation upon which all subsequent phases will build. If theories prove correct, this acquisition validates 13 years of preparation. She continued writing for another hour, documenting every detail she had observed about Thomas. To Margaret, he was not a person. He was the key to unlocking what she believed were the secrets of human heredity, and she would spend the next 4 years preparing him for a role so disturbing that when the truth finally emerged, it would haunt Chatham County for generations. Thomas's days at Belmont followed a rigid schedule that Margaret enforced with absolute consistency. He woke each morning at 6:00 when Margaret herself unlocked his door, a routine she maintained to establish her complete authority. She would enter with measuring tape and notebook, recording his height against marks on the door frame. Once per week, she weighed him on a scale imported from Philadelphia. Once per month, she performed a complete physical examination that lasted over an hour, measuring every aspect of his development with clinical precision. After morning measurements, Thomas received breakfast, cornmeal mush occasionally supplemented with milk or molasses. Margaret had calculated precise caloric intake necessary for optimal growth. At 7:00, his education began. Margaret had hired a tutor, a nervous young man from Savannah named Christopher Vance, who came twice weekly to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. Vance believed he was participating in progressive research testing whether enslaved children could learn academic subjects. He had no idea about Margaret's broader project. Thomas proved an exceptional student, absorbing information with impressive speed. By the end of his first year, he could read complex texts, write in clear handwriting, and perform advanced mathematics. Margaret seemed pleased, though her satisfaction manifested as clinical approval rather than warmth. She assigned him books from her library, anatomical texts with detailed illustrations, agricultural manuals about livestock breeding, natural philosophy books discussing heredity and variation. But the true purpose of his education became clear during Margaret's private lessons. She would sit across from Thomas in one of the compound school rooms, anatomy charts hanging between them, and explain her theories. She showed him how characteristics passed from parents to children, displayed charts documenting horse breeding, and explained how desirable traits could be concentrated through careful selection. Then she would transition, her voice never changing tone, to human heredity. She explained her belief that races represented different developmental stages, that characteristics like intelligence and beauty were inherited and could be improved through selective breeding. Thomas listened with his face impassive, his pale eyes fixed on the charts. He had learned that interrupting brought sharp rebukes. Margaret never struck him. She did not need to. The isolation and total control she exercised were punishment enough. He was allowed contact with no one except Margaret, Vance, and occasionally Augustus, who brought supplies, but never spoke beyond necessary words. What Thomas did not yet understand was that Margaret was preparing him for a specific role. She was educating him not from progressive ideals, but because she needed him to comprehend what would eventually be required. She needed him to understand heredity, to grasp why certain pairings produced certain results, to appreciate the significance of her experiment. Because eventually, when he matured, he would become not just a subject of observation, but an active participant in creating what Margaret called her improved line. The compound held others beyond Thomas, though he rarely saw them. Through his window, he sometimes glimpsed people moving between buildings under escort. He heard voices occasionally muffled through walls. At night, sometimes there were sounds that disturbed him, crying, screaming, or long silences that felt worse. He learned never to ask about these things. Margaret maintained approximately 25 people in the compound at any time, though specific individuals changed frequently. She acquired them through various means, purchasing those with particular characteristics, accepting people other owners wanted to dispose of, occasionally bringing in people from her main plantation when they exhibited traits she wanted to study. These people lived in communal rooms, sleeping on pallets given adequate food and shelter, but kept in complete isolation from the outside world. Margaret maintained detailed records on each person, measurements, health status, family history if known, and specific characteristics she deemed desirable or undesirable. She arranged pairings with cold calculation, keeping charts that tracked which combinations produced children with which traits. Over 13 years, she had documented dozens of births. But the records also showed something darker. A high mortality rate, especially among infants, and numerous disappearances. The truth about these disappearances was perhaps the darkest aspect. When children were born with what Margaret called degenerate characteristics, severe deformities, or health problems, they did not survive long. Her records noted they failed to thrive or expired due to natural weakness. But witnesses who came forward after Margaret's death told different stories. They described infants taken away shortly after birth and never seen again. They described a small cemetery deep in the pine forest marked only by numbered wooden stakes. They described the copper-lined basement where Margaret preserved biological specimens in alcohol jars, including some that appeared disturbingly human. Thomas knew none of this during his early years. His world consisted of his room, the schoolroom, the examination room, and occasionally the yard where Margaret allowed him supervised exercise. She maintained his health carefully, ensuring adequate nutrition, fresh air, and physical activity. But it was livestock management, not compassion. As Thomas approached his 14th birthday in 1857, Margaret's lessons took on new dimensions. She began explaining reproductive biology in explicit detail, using anatomical charts and preserved specimens. She discussed conception, gestation, and birth with clinical precision. She explained genetic inheritance with growing emphasis on his unique characteristics. "You represent something remarkable," she told him during one lesson, her eyes studying him with calculating intensity. "Your albinism is a pure expression of recessive characteristics. If paired correctly with subjects possessing complementary traits, the offspring would be invaluable for understanding hereditary mechanisms. You are not simply a subject to be observed, Thomas. You are the key to the next phase of this research." Thomas was intelligent enough to understand what she suggested, and the knowledge filled him with profound dread. But he had nowhere to run. The compound was surrounded by miles of forest patrolled by overseers with dogs. Even if he escaped, where would an albino teenage boy go in 1857 Georgia? He would be captured immediately, returned, punished severely. Margaret owned him as completely as she owned her furniture, and the law supported her absolute right to do anything she wanted. But during his recovery from a serious bout of pneumonia in spring 1858, something unexpected occurred. Augustus, the driver, began speaking to him during supply deliveries. Brief conversations, never more than a few sentences, always when Margaret was absent. Augustus would ask how Thomas felt, comment on weather, mention small details about life outside the compound. These tiny human connections after years of isolation and clinical treatment affected Thomas profoundly. One afternoon in June 1858, as Thomas sat in the yard regaining his strength, Augustus brought supplies and lingered. "You know she won't stop," he said quietly. "Whatever she's planning, she won't stop. But you're smarter than most. You've been learning from her books. Maybe you can figure something she can't." Before Thomas could respond, Augustus moved away. But the words planted something in Thomas's mind. For 3 years he had been passive, accepting his fate because he saw no alternative. But Augustus was right. He could read. He had access to Margaret's library. He understood more about her theories than she realized. And if he was careful, patient, and clever, perhaps he could find a way to use that knowledge. As summer arrived and Thomas's health returned, Margaret resumed her lessons with renewed intensity. She informed him that the following year, when he turned 15, he would begin the next phase. She had identified several women in the compound with what she called optimal characteristics, and Thomas would be paired with them to produce children that could be studied from birth. She explained this with clinical detachment, as if discussing crop rotation, rather than the systematic exploitation of a teenage boy. Thomas listened, nodded, and said nothing. But behind his pale eyes, something had changed. He was no longer just a passive subject. He was planning, and as he lay in his room each night, he began to understand that knowledge could be a weapon. Margaret had educated him as part of her experiment, never considering that education might give him tools to resist. It was a mistake that would eventually unravel everything she had built. The autumn of 1858 brought an unexpected complication. Harrison Pembroke arrived at Belmont on October 12th unannounced and carrying a letter of introduction from the Medical Society of Charleston. Pembroke, a rising figure in Southern medical circles, had developed a fascination with hereditary pathologies. He had heard rumors of Margaret's private research facility and traveled from South Carolina specifically to meet her. Margaret received him in the main house, serving tea while assessing this unexpected visitor. Pembroke was 42, tall and thin, with angular features and hands that moved constantly as he spoke. He had studied medicine in Philadelphia before returning to Charleston to establish a practice. But his true passion was research. He showed Margaret his published papers on hereditary illness, his theories about racial characteristics, his belief that scientific breeding could improve human stock. The future of medicine lies not in treating illness after it appears, Pembroke explained enthusiastically, but in preventing weak bloodlines from reproducing. Imagine a world where hereditary diseases are eliminated through careful selection, where each generation is stronger than the last. This is achievable through systematic breeding principles. Margaret listened, calculating rapidly. Pembroke represented both opportunity and threat. An opportunity because his medical expertise exceeded hers and he might advance her research. A threat because he might discover the full scope of her experiments and react with moral objection. Many physicians espouse eugenic theories abstractly but might balk at practical applications. "Your ideas are fascinating, Dr. Pembroke," she said carefully. "I have maintained some observations of heredity among the enslaved population here. Nothing as systematic as your research, perhaps, but enough to convince me that animal husbandry principles do apply to human beings." Pembroke leaned forward, eyes bright. "I would be honored to see your work. Perhaps I might contribute observations that could advance both our studies." After a long pause, Margaret made her decision. "Very well, doctor, I will show you my facility, but I must insist on complete discretion. The work is scientifically sound, but the general public lacks education to understand its importance." "You have my word as a gentleman and man of science," Pembroke replied solemnly. The following morning, Margaret led Pembroke to the compound. As they walked through pine forest, she explained her theories and methods in greater detail than she had ever shared. She described 13 years of controlled breeding, meticulous documentation, attempts to isolate and predict hereditary traits. Pembroke listened with rapt attention, occasionally interjecting questions that demonstrated his medical knowledge and genuine interest. When they reached the compound, Margaret first took him to the building containing her records. Shelf after shelf of journals, charts, and diagrams documenting births, deaths, measurements, and observations spanning over a decade. Pembroke examined these with growing excitement. Extraordinary, he murmured, examining a journal from 1847 documenting 3 generations of a family line. You have maintained consistency across years. The level of detail is remarkable. He paused, reading more carefully, though I must say the infant mortality rate appears quite high, 37% in this cohort alone. Margaret had anticipated this. Weak specimens, she replied smoothly. Those with obvious deformities or constitutional weaknesses suggesting degenerate heredity. I have maintained detailed autopsy records on each case. The losses, while regrettable, provide valuable data about which characteristics breed true and which represent hereditary failure. Pembroke nodded slowly, though discomfort flickered across his face, but scientific curiosity overrode moral qualms. And you have preserved specimens. They descended into the copper-lined basement where Margaret maintained her collection. Rows of glass jars lined wooden shelves, each containing biological specimens suspended in clear fluid. Pembroke examined them with professional interest, making notes. Most were organs or tissue samples, but several jars contained small, fully formed bodies. Infants no more than a few days old, their tiny faces frozen in expressions suggesting they had not died peacefully. You conducted autopsies yourself? Pembroke asked. I had assistance from a physician in Savannah initially until he passed in 1851. Since then, I have performed examinations independently. My anatomical knowledge is largely self-taught, but adequate for the purpose, more than adequate. Pembroke straightened, closing his notebook. Mrs. Dunor, what you have accomplished here represents a singular achievement. The scope, duration, and attention to detail are remarkable. You should publish these findings. Margaret shook her head. Publication is impossible. The public would never understand. I am content to continue research privately, advancing knowledge for its own sake. Then perhaps we might collaborate, Pembroke suggested. I could analyze your data, contribute medical expertise, help design additional studies. With proper methodology, we could produce findings that would revolutionize understanding of human heredity. Margaret considered carefully. Collaboration meant shared control and increased risk of exposure, but the possibility of achieving true scientific breakthrough was alluring. Let me show you the crown jewel of the project, she said finally. She led him to Thomas's room. The boy sat at his table, reading from a medical text. He looked up as the door opened, pale eyes moving from Margaret to the stranger. At 15, Thomas had grown considerably, though he remained thin. His white blonde hair was cut short, and his pallid skin seemed almost luminous in the afternoon light. This is Subject 0, Margaret announced with unmistakable pride, a pure albino acquired 4 years ago specifically for this project. I have documented every aspect of his development, provided extensive education in anatomy and natural philosophy, and maintained his health carefully in preparation for the breeding phase. Pembroke stared with undisguised fascination. He approached slowly and spent the next 30 minutes conducting a thorough examination while Thomas sat motionless, enduring the stranger's probing hands with passive acceptance learned over years in the compound. Pembroke measured, palpated, looked into Thomas's eyes with various instruments. He asked questions about health history, vision, and sensitivity to sunlight. Thomas answered in a quiet, educated voice that clearly surprised Pembroke. You have taught him to speak properly, Pembroke observed, and to read interesting choice. Education serves multiple purposes, Margaret explained. It allows him to understand the research significance, ensuring cooperation. It provides data on intellectual capacity of albino subjects. And practically, as he matures, he will need to understand breeding protocols sufficiently to participate effectively. Pembroke straightened. Participate in breeding protocols. You intend to use him as a stud essentially when he reaches appropriate maturity. Yes, he is now 15. I plan to begin the breeding phase within 6 months, pairing him with carefully selected women to produce offspring that can be studied from conception through development. The hereditary transmission of albinism is poorly understood. By controlling parentage and documenting results across multiple pairings, we can determine whether it breeds true and what other characteristics are linked to it. For the first time, Pembroke looked genuinely uncomfortable. His eyes moved from Margaret to Thomas and back. He is still quite young. Enslaved boys his age father children regularly throughout the South. Margaret replied coolly, "There is nothing unusual in this. And unlike field workers forced into casual unions, Subject Zero will participate in controlled documented breeding for scientific purposes. The context is entirely different." Pembroke said nothing for a long moment. Scientific enthusiasm wearing with residual moral sense, but Margaret had calculated correctly that intellectual ambition would win. "What assurances do I have that offspring will be properly documented?" he finally asked. "Without complete records from conception through maturity, the data loses much value." "I have maintained such records for 13 years, Margaret said. "I have no intention of relaxing standards now. Every conception will be documented, every pregnancy monitored, every birth recorded in detail. Children will be raised here where development can be observed systematically. You will have complete access to all records." "Then I accept your offer of collaboration." Pembroke said, "I can visit monthly to conduct examinations and contribute medical expertise. In exchange, I ask only that I receive credit when these findings are eventually published." They shook hands on the arrangement. Thomas watched this exchange in silence, understanding with perfect clarity that his fate had just been sealed. The one hope he had harbored, that Margaret might postpone or abandon her plans, evaporated. She had found validation from a respected physician who not only accepted her work, but wanted to participate. There would be no reprieve. After Pembroke departed that evening, Margaret visited Thomas's room. "Pembroke is impressed with our work," she said. "He believes we are on the verge of significant scientific breakthrough. You should feel privileged to participate in research of such importance." Thomas remained silent. "I expect your cooperation," Margaret continued, voice hardening. "You have been given advantages no enslaved person could dream of. Education, adequate food and shelter, protection from fieldwork brutalities. I have invested considerable resources in your development. The time has come for you to fulfill the purpose for which you were acquired." Still, Thomas said nothing. Margaret studied him briefly, then left, locking the door behind her. In darkness, Thomas finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of despair. He was 15 years old, utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare that presented itself as science. And now, a respected physician had validated everything Margaret believed, ensuring the horror would continue and escalate. But Thomas had spent 4 years reading Margaret's books, studying her theories, understanding how she thought, and he had begun noticing something neither Margaret nor Pembroke seemed to recognize. Their grand theories about heredity, their predictions about which traits would appear in offspring, were wrong more often than right. Margaret's charts showed disappointing results. Children who did not match predictions, characteristics that appeared or disappeared without explanation. Margaret attributed failures to insufficient data or hidden hereditary factors. But Thomas, reading the same books, understanding the same theories, had begun suspecting something more fundamental, that heredity was far more complex than anyone yet understood, and that Margaret's confidence in controlling and predicting it was a delusion. This insight gave him something he had not had before. Hope. Not hope for escape, which seemed impossible, but hope that Margaret's experiment might fail on its own terms, that results might prove so inconsistent that even she would be forced to acknowledge limitations. It was thin hope, dependent on outcomes years in the future. But it was something, and as Thomas lay in his narrow bed that October night, he made a silent vow. He would cooperate with Margaret's demands because he had no choice, but he would watch, learn, and remember. And if he survived long enough, if Margaret's experiment eventually unraveled, as he suspected it would, he would make certain the world knew what happened in this hidden place. Harrison Pembroke returned to Belmont on November 18, 1858, carrying medical instruments, journals, and supplies he deemed necessary for what he called proper scientific documentation of the breeding phase. Margaret received him warmly, relieved to have found not just a collaborator, but someone who shared her vision completely. Thomas had been prepared for Pembroke's visit. Margaret had explained in clinical detail what would be expected, using anatomical charts and breeding manuals to illustrate procedures. She had selected 3 women from the compound's population, all in their late teens or early 20s, all exhibiting what she called optimal physical characteristics. She showed Thomas their documentation, detailed measurements, family histories, health assessments. She explained he would be paired with each woman in succession, that conceptions and pregnancies would be monitored closely, that resulting children would remain in the compound for systematic study. Thomas listened with his face carefully blank, revealing nothing of the revulsion and terror inside. He understood resistance was impossible. Margaret had absolute power over everyone in the compound, and Pembroke's participation added medical authority to her commands. The first woman Margaret selected was named Eliza. She was 19, tall and slender, with features Margaret's records described as refined type, suggesting mixed heredity favorable for observing albinism transmission. Eliza had been at the compound for 2 years, taken from Belmont's main plantation after giving birth to a child Margaret wanted to study. That child, a daughter, had been removed shortly after birth. Eliza never saw her again. The experience left her withdrawn and deeply traumatized, though Margaret's notes characterized her simply as compliant subject with minimal resistance. Margaret brought Eliza to Thomas's room on a cold November afternoon. Pembroke waited outside, ready to enter after what Margaret estimated would be sufficient time. She explained to both what was expected, her voice carrying no more emotion than if instructing servants on housekeeping. Then she left them alone, locking the door from outside. For a long time, neither moved nor spoke. They stood on opposite sides of the small room, two terrified young people trapped in a nightmare. Neither had power to escape. Finally, Eliza broke the silence. "I know you," she said softly. "I seen you from the window sometimes. The white boy she keeps locked up. Been here long as me, maybe longer." Thomas nodded. 4 years. What she make you do? Study, read her books, learn about. He gestured helplessly at anatomical charts on the wall. This Eliza moved to the window. "My baby was a girl. Pretty little thing. Mrs. Dunor took her away that same night. Told me the baby died, but I heard her crying for days after in some other part of the building. Then I didn't hear nothing no more." Her voice was flat, drained of emotion by grief too large to fully express. "You think that baby really died?" Thomas did not answer because he did not know what truth would be kinder. Instead, he said, "I'm sorry." Eliza turned to look at him, her eyes holding depths of sorrow. "You and me, we got no choices here. She own us. She can make us do whatever she want. So I guess we do what she say and maybe we survive. That's all there is. What happened next in that locked room will not be described in detail because some horrors need not be rendered explicit to be understood. It is enough to say that two young people stripped of all agency tried to retain some shred of dignity in an utterly degrading situation. When Margaret unlocked the door an hour later, followed by Pembroke carrying medical instruments, both Thomas and Eliza had been changed in ways that would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives. Pembroke conducted an examination of Eliza that was invasive and humiliating, documenting everything in his notebook with clinical precision. He discussed findings with Margaret as if Eliza were not present, using medical terminology that dehumanized her completely. Then he dismissed her and she was escorted back to her sleeping quarters. Thomas remained, and Pembroke subjected him to similar examination and questioning, recording observations about his physical response, emotional state, and comprehension of what had occurred. Margaret and Pembroke repeated this process with the second woman, Sarah, on November 25th. Sarah was 18 at the compound, only 6 months, purchased from a plantation near Augusta because Margaret's records indicated desirable hereditary traits. Unlike Eliza, whose trauma produced resignation, Sarah's manifested as rage. When Margaret explained what would be required, Sarah refused outright, voice shaking with fury and fear. "You can beat me, sell me, kill me," Sarah said, "but I ain't doing this. This ain't right, and you know it." Margaret remained unmoved. "You have no right to refuse. You are property purchased specifically for this purpose. Your cooperation is required. Then you're going to have to force me." Margaret nodded to the overseer. "Take her to the isolation room. No food until she reconsiders." Sarah was locked in a small windowless basement room, receiving only water and a single small piece of bread daily. She remained there for 6 days. On the second day, Margaret visited to ask if she had reconsidered. Sarah, weakened but defiant, refused. On the 4th day, Margaret visited with Pembroke, who explained in medical terms the damage prolonged starvation would cause, emphasizing permanent harm she was inflicting on herself through pointless resistance. Sarah wept, but did not relent. On the 6th day, Margaret took a different approach. She brought Eliza to the isolation room and made her describe what had happened, emphasizing that Eliza had survived, had not been physically harmed, that continued resistance would only prolong Sarah's suffering without changing the outcome. Eliza, exhausted and broken, delivered this message as instructed, though her voice carried an apology Margaret had not scripted. Sarah finally surrendered. She was too weak to walk, so the overseer carried her to Thomas's room where the process was repeated. Pembroke documented everything with clinical detachment, noting that subject's physical condition compromised by resistance period recommend improved nutritional preparation for future pairings. The third woman, Hannah, witnessed what happened to Sarah and offered no resistance when her turn came in early December. She was 21 at the compound for 3 years and had learned long ago that survival meant absolute submission. She complied with everything Margaret demanded, her face an expressionless mask, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. Afterward, Pembroke noted with satisfaction that subject demonstrated optimal compliance, suggesting effective conditioning protocols. Thomas endured these weeks in a state of numb dissociation. Each night, locked in his room, he stared at the ceiling and tried to separate his mind from his body to preserve some core of self that remained untouched by what Margaret forced him to do. He read obsessively, losing himself in anatomical diagrams and breeding charts, anything to avoid thinking. And he watched Margaret's records carefully whenever he had access, noting growing discrepancies between her predictions and actual results from previous experiments. Margaret, meanwhile, was triumphant. She had successfully initiated the breeding phase with Subject 0, documenting every detail with Pembroke's assistance. She calculated conception probabilities, estimated gestation periods, planned observation protocols for the pregnancies she anticipated. In her journal, she wrote extensive entries predicting that offspring would provide unprecedented insights into albinism inheritance. But nature had its own plans. Of the 3 women, only Eliza conceived. Sarah and Hannah's bodies, stressed by trauma and harsh conditions, did not support conception despite repeated pairings in subsequent months. Margaret attributed this to constitutional weakness, noting it as data supporting her theories. She did not consider or chose not to acknowledge that profound trauma might affect fertility. Eliza's pregnancy was monitored with obsessive attention. Margaret and Pembroke examined her weekly, measuring her abdomen, listening to the fetal heartbeat, documenting every aspect of gestation. They discussed predictions. Would the child show albinism? What would the skin color be? The eye color? They debated these questions with scientific enthusiasm, apparently blind to Eliza's growing despair as her pregnancy advanced. Thomas saw Eliza occasionally from his window or during brief periods when compound residents were allowed in the yard. Her belly grew through winter into spring. She moved slowly, heavily, her face drawn with exhaustion and something deeper. Once their eyes met across the yard, and Thomas saw grief so profound it stopped his breath. She was mourning her child before it was even born, knowing what fate awaited any baby born in this place. As Eliza's due date approached in May 1859, Margaret prepared the compound's medical room with additional supplies. She had delivered numerous babies in the compound over the years, and she approached this birth with particular anticipation. Pembroke arranged to be present, bringing specialized instruments and promising to conduct immediate examination of the newborn to document initial characteristics. The birth happened on May 17, 1859. After 18 hours of labor, Margaret and Pembroke attended throughout, treating Eliza's suffering as an inconvenient but necessary aspect of data collection. When the baby finally emerged, a girl weighing just over 6 lb, Margaret's first action was not to comfort the exhausted mother, but to examine the infant's skin and eyes under bright lamplight. The baby was not albino. Her skin was light brown, her eyes dark, her hair black. She appeared entirely healthy, crying vigorously when Pembroke conducted his examination. Margaret's initial reaction was visible disappointment. After 4 years of preparation, selecting and educating Subject 0, carefully orchestrating this breeding experiment, the primary characteristic she had hoped to study had not appeared in the first offspring. Recessive trait, Pembroke observed, making notes. As expected, requires both parents to carry the characteristic. The mother obviously does not carry albinism genes, therefore offspring shows normal pigmentation. We would need multiple generations and careful selection to isolate the recessive expression. Margaret nodded, her mind already calculating next steps. Subject 0 will need to be paired with his own female offspring. Once they reach maturity, that is the only way to increase probability of albino expression in subsequent generations. This child will be designated Generation 1, Female 1. When she reaches approximately 15 years of age, she will be bred back to subject zero. Eliza, lying exhausted on the birthing bed, overheard this conversation. The implications were clear enough even through her pain and fatigue. They intended to take her daughter, raise her in this compound, and eventually force her into the same nightmare Eliza had endured. The realization produced a sound from Eliza that was not quite a scream, not quite a sob, but something more primal, a sound of absolute despair that would haunt Thomas, who heard it from his locked room, for the rest of his life. Margaret allowed Eliza to nurse the baby for 1 week, long enough to establish feeding. Then on May 24th, the infant was removed and taken to a separate room where a wet nurse, another enslaved woman, would provide care under Margaret's supervision. Eliza was returned to the general population of the compound, her body still recovering from birth, her arms empty, her milk drying painfully because she had no baby to feed. The compound fell into a strange, tense quiet after that week in May. The sounds from other buildings ceased almost entirely. Even Margaret seemed subdued, though she maintained her routines and continued documenting observations with mechanical precision. Something had shifted. Some balance had broken, though Thomas could not identify exactly what. What no one knew was that Eliza had made a decision during that week when she was allowed to hold her daughter. A decision born from love so fierce it manifested as terrible action. On the 6th night, when darkness was complete and the compound was quiet, Eliza did something that ensured her daughter would never be used in Margaret Dunor's experiment. The wet nurse found both of them the next morning, Eliza's arms wrapped around the tiny body that had ceased breathing sometime in the night. The details were never recorded, the method never documented. Margaret simply noted in her records, Generation 1 female, 1 expired due to unknown cause. Subject Eliza subsequently disposed of as unreliable for further breeding protocols. What disposed of meant was never explained in the documents, but Eliza was never seen again in the compound after that day. And in the small cemetery deep in the pine forest, a witness who came forward decades later remembered digging 2 graves that week in May. Not one. A larger grave and a smaller one, marked only with wooden stakes that eventually rotted away, leaving no trace that either of them had ever existed. The summer of 1859 brought stifling heat to Chatham County, and with it came an unexpected visitor who would change everything. Dr. Samuel Hargrave from Atlanta arrived at Belmont on July 8th, accompanied by a young medical assistant named Robert Chen. Hargrave had corresponded with Margaret about her research after reading one of Pembroke's published papers that made vague references to systematic hereditary studies being conducted in Georgia. Intrigued, Hargrave had written to Margaret requesting permission to visit, and she had agreed, hoping to replace the increasingly unreliable Pembroke with a more stable collaborator. Robert Chen was 24 years old, the son of immigrants who had come to San Francisco during the gold rush before eventually settling in Georgia. He was assisting Hargrave with research for a book on human anatomical variation across different populations. Chen approached the visit to Belmont with professional curiosity, expecting to see interesting documentation of hereditary patterns. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. Margaret gave them the same tour she had given Pembroke, the records room with its shelves of journals and charts, the basement with its preserved specimens, and finally the introduction to Subject Zero. But where Pembroke had responded with scientific enthusiasm tempered by growing unease, Chen's reaction was immediate and visceral horror. As Margaret explained her methods, detailing the forced pairings, the systematic breeding, the high infant mortality rate, Chen's face grew progressively paler. When she described her plans to breed Thomas with his own offspring once they matured, Chen could no longer remain silent. "Mrs. Dunor," he said carefully, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "What you describe is not research, it is systematic brutality. These are human beings, not livestock. No scientific knowledge could justify such violations of human dignity." Margaret stiffened, her face wreathing. "You are young and influenced by sentimental notions that have no place in scientific inquiry. These are enslaved people, legally my property, whose reproduction I control absolutely under the law. I am using that legal authority to advance human knowledge. Your moral objections are irrelevant. The law does not determine morality," Chen replied steadily, despite the danger of contradicting a wealthy woman in her own home. "What is legal can still be profoundly wrong. What you are doing here is wrong, Mrs. Dunor." History will judge this harshly. Hargrave attempted to mediate, but Chen would not be silenced. There is no theoretical framework that justifies treating human beings as breeding stock. I have seen enough. I will not participate in this, and I strongly advise you, Dr. Hargrave, to withdraw as well. Margaret ordered both men off her property immediately. They departed within the hour, though not before Chen had a brief interaction that would prove significant. While waiting for Hargrave to collect his belongings, Chen wandered down the hallway where Thomas's room was located. Through the door's small window, he saw the pale boy sitting at his table reading. Something about the scene struck Chen as unbearably sad. He knocked softly on the door. Thomas looked up startled. Visitors never knocked. He approached the door cautiously. "What is your name?" Chen asked through the window. "Thomas, sir. How long have you been here?" 5 years, sir." "Do you want to leave?" The question was so unexpected that Thomas did not know how to answer. After a long pause, he simply said yes. Chen nodded, committing the boy's face to memory. "I will remember you, Thomas. I promise I will remember." Then Hargrave called for him, and Chen had to leave. Thomas watched through the window as the two men departed. He did not understand the significance of that exchange, but something in Chen's eyes planted a seed of hope. Chen and Hargrave argued during their journey back to Atlanta. Hargrave tried to defend Margaret's work using scientific rationalization, but Chen's moral certainty eventually wore him down. By the time they reached Atlanta, Hargrave reluctantly agreed that what happened at Belmont crossed ethical lines, though he refused to take action against Margaret. Chen had no such hesitation. Within days of returning to Atlanta, he began writing letters to medical societies, abolitionist organizations, and newspapers describing what he had witnessed at Belmont in carefully detailed terms. He documented everything: the forced breeding, the preserved infant specimens, the systematic exploitation, and most importantly, he described Thomas, the albino boy, locked in a room and being prepared for breeding experiments. The response was not what Chen hoped. In late 1859, with sectional tensions building toward war, most institutions were unwilling to investigate the internal operations of a Georgia plantation, especially on the word of a young Chinese medical assistant making extraordinary claims against a wealthy white woman. The medical societies thanked him for his concern, but took no action. The newspapers declined to publish his accounts, citing lack of corroborating evidence. Even abolitionist groups, though sympathetic, had limited resources. Frustrated but undeterred, Chen made a decision that would prove fateful. On December 12, 1859, just days after John Brown's execution sent shock waves through the South, Chen traveled back to Chatham County. He did not approach Belmont directly. Instead, he began quietly interviewing people in the area. Drivers, tradesmen, overseers from other plantations, free blacks in Savannah, who might have heard rumors from enslaved people at Belmont. Slowly, carefully, he assembled testimonies that corroborated his observations. Margaret learned of Chen's investigation in late December when an overseer from a neighboring plantation mentioned that a Chinese man had been asking questions about Belmont's slave population. Margaret immediately understood the threat. She had maintained her compound in secrecy for 14 years through isolation, intimidation, and the general unwillingness of anyone to interfere with a plantation owner's business. But Chen represented something new. An outsider with no financial stake in the system, no social connection to Georgia's plantation society, and a moral conviction strong enough to override practical concerns. Margaret's response was calculated and ruthless. She could not simply have Chen killed. His disappearance would attract exactly the attention she needed to avoid. Instead, she began destroying evidence. She burned journals containing the most damning details, disposed of the most disturbing preserved specimens, and reduced the compound's population by selling people to distant plantations where they could not easily be questioned. Most significantly, she made preparations to relocate Thomas entirely, possibly to property she owned in Alabama. But Margaret had made a critical error. In her haste to eliminate evidence, she failed to account for Augustus, her longtime driver who had witnessed 14 years of horror at Belmont and had finally reached his breaking point. Augustus had seen Eliza and her baby buried in the forest. He had transported countless people to the compound who were never seen again. He had delivered supplies for Margaret's experiments and remained silent because he believed he had no choice. But Chen's investigation gave him something he had not had before: hope that someone might actually listen. On January 15, 1860, Augustus made contact with Chen through an intermediary in Savannah. They met secretly in a warehouse near the docks. and Augustus told Chen everything he knew. He described the hidden compound, the forced breeding, the high mortality rate, the cemetery and the forest with its numbered stakes. He provided names of people who had disappeared, dates when they had been taken to the compound, details about Margaret's methods and her obsessive documentation. Most importantly, he drew a map showing the location of the compound and described how to access it without being detected. Chen now had corroborating testimony from someone who had been inside Belmont for years. It was exactly what he needed to force authorities to act. He traveled to Savannah and presented his evidence to the county sheriff, a man named William Pritchard. Chen laid out everything: his own observations, Augustus' testimony, the physical evidence that still existed at the compound despite Margaret's destruction efforts. Pritchard was in a difficult position. Margaret Dunor was wealthy, influential, and well-connected. Investigating her based on accusations from a Chinese medical assistant and an enslaved driver could end his career if the charges proved false or exaggerated. But Chen's documentation was detailed and specific, and if even half of what he alleged was true, Pritchard could not ignore it without becoming complicit. On January 23, 1860, Sheriff Pritchard, accompanied by 2 deputies and Robert Chen, arrived at Belmont with a court order to inspect the compound. Margaret met them at the main house, her face a mask of cold fury, but she could not refuse a court order. She led them down the narrow road through the pine forest to the hidden buildings, and what they found there confirmed Chen's worst descriptions. The compound population had been reduced to just 8 people, all appearing malnourished and traumatized. The records room had been largely emptied, with ash still visible in the fireplace where Margaret had burned journals. But she had not destroyed everything. Pembroke's detailed medical notes remained, documenting forced pairings and pregnancy observations with clinical precision. The basement still contained dozens of preserved specimens, including several that were clearly human infants. And most damning, they found Thomas locked in his room, 15 years old, and able to articulate exactly what had happened to him over the past 5 years. Pritchard was horrified. He had expected to find evidence of harsh treatment, perhaps some questionable breeding practices, but nothing had prepared him for the systematic nature of Margaret's experiment. He placed Margaret under house arrest pending formal charges and ordered the compound closed. The 8 remaining residents were removed and placed temporarily in the county poorhouse while authorities determined their legal status. Thomas, because of his unique circumstances and ability to testify, was placed under the protection of the court. Margaret's response was immediate and characteristically calculated. She hired the best lawyers money could buy, men who had built careers defending plantation owners against accusations of cruelty. Their strategy was simple. Everything Margaret had done was legal under Georgia law. Enslaved people were property. Owners had absolute discretion over their reproduction, living conditions, and treatment. The law explicitly gave Margaret the right to do everything Chen and Pritchard accused her of doing. The forced breeding, the medical experiments, even the high infant mortality rate were all within her legal rights as a property owner. It was a defense that would likely succeed. In 1860 Georgia, no jury would convict a wealthy white woman for actions that were technically legal, no matter how morally repugnant. Chen knew this. Pritchard knew this. And Margaret's lawyers knew this. The case would likely be dismissed before it ever reached trial. But then something unexpected happened that changed everything. Harrison Pembroke, the physician who had collaborated with Margaret for over a year, came forward. He had been living in Charleston, drinking heavily, consumed by guilt over his participation in the experiment. When he learned of the investigation, something broke inside him. On February 8, 1860, Pembroke traveled to Savannah and provided testimony that corroborated every detail of Chen's accusations. More importantly, as a respected white physician, his testimony carried weight that Chen's and Augustus did not. Pembroke described the forced pairings in graphic detail. He provided dates, names, and specific medical observations. He admitted his own participation and expressed profound remorse. He stated clearly that what happened at Belmont was not legitimate research, but systematic brutality disguised as science. His testimony was devastating, and it came from someone the court could not easily dismiss. With Pembroke's testimony added to the evidence, the case against Margaret became much stronger. But Margaret's lawyers adapted their strategy. They argued that even if everything alleged was true, it still did not constitute a crime under Georgia law. They were preparing to file motions to dismiss all charges when events outside Chatham County intervened in ways no one could have predicted. Just when we thought we understood the full scope of Margaret Dunor's experiments, the investigation uncovered something even more disturbing. If you have been following this dark journey into one of Georgia's most suppressed historical horrors, this is the moment when everything unravels. Hit that like button if this story has kept you on the edge of your seat. Share it with someone who appreciates true historical mysteries, and make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the conclusion. Now, let me tell you how the truth about Belmont finally came to light, though not in any way that would bring real justice. In March 1860, as Margaret's lawyers maneuvered to have all charges dismissed, Chen made one final effort to expose the full scope of the Belmont horrors. He had been investigating one persistent question that no one had adequately answered. What happened to all the people who had disappeared from the compound over 14 years? Augustus had mentioned a cemetery in the forest with numbered wooden stakes, but he had never been allowed close enough to determine how many graves it contained. On March 14, 1860, Chen, accompanied by Sheriff Pritchard and 2 deputies, searched the pine forest behind the compound until they found the cemetery Augustus had described. What they discovered was far worse than anyone had imagined. The wooden stakes had mostly rotted away, but careful examination of the ground revealed disturbances indicating at least 47 separate grave sites, 47 people buried in unmarked graves in a hidden cemetery. Their deaths never reported, their names never recorded in any official document. Pritchard ordered excavations of several graves to determine cause of death. What they found was horrifying. Multiple infant remains, some showing signs of physical deformities, others appearing entirely healthy. Several adult remains that forensic examination suggested had died of malnutrition or untreated illness. And most disturbing, 3 adult remains that showed evidence of violence, broken bones that had never healed, skull fractures, injuries that could not have been accidental. This discovery changed everything. Margaret could argue that breeding enslaved people was legal, that high infant mortality was unfortunate but not criminal. But murder was murder, regardless of the victim's legal status. The evidence of violence in those graves suggested that some people in the compound had not simply died from neglect or harsh conditions. They had been killed. When confronted with this evidence, Margaret maintained that she had no knowledge of any violence. She claimed that if anyone had been killed, it must have been the work of overseers acting without her authorization or conflicts among the enslaved people themselves. Her lawyers argued that without witnesses or documentation proving Margaret personally committed or ordered any killings, the murder charges could not be sustained. But Margaret had not accounted for one person, Hannah, the 3rd woman forced to pair with Thomas, who had survived the experiment through absolute submission. Hannah had been one of the 8 people removed from the compound when it was closed. She had remained silent during initial questioning, traumatized and afraid. But when she learned about the cemetery and the evidence of violence, something shifted in her. On March 22, 1860, Hannah came forward with testimony that would finally break through Margaret's legal defenses. Hannah described witnessing Margaret personally administering poison to an infant who had been born with severe deformities. She described seeing Margaret strike a woman who had refused breeding protocols, hitting her with such force that the woman collapsed and never regained consciousness. She described Margaret ordering an overseer to dispose of a man who had become too ill to be useful for breeding experiments. Hannah provided dates, names, and specific details that could be corroborated against the grave sites and Margaret's remaining records. Hannah's testimony was given at tremendous personal risk. As an enslaved woman testifying against a white property owner, she had no legal standing in Georgia courts. Her testimony would normally be inadmissible, but the circumstances were unusual enough and the physical evidence compelling enough that the judge allowed her testimony to be entered into the record, though he made clear it could not alone support a conviction. Margaret's lawyers attacked Hannah's credibility viciously, arguing that enslaved people routinely lied to harm their owners, that Hannah's testimony was motivated by resentment over being used in breeding experiments, that nothing she said could be trusted. The legal battle dragged through March and into April 1860, with both sides marshaling evidence and expert testimony, and then on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter and the Civil War began. Within weeks, all attention in Georgia shifted to the war effort. Margaret's case, which had been slowly grinding through the legal system, was indefinitely postponed. Sheriff Pritchard was called up for military service. The judge hearing the case left to serve as a military advisor. The county records office, which had been compiling evidence, closed as staff enlisted or fled. Margaret, still under house arrest but no longer actively prosecuted, saw an opportunity. In June 1861, she sold Belmont to a consortium of investors from Savannah, claiming she needed to relocate for health reasons. The sale included all property except the compound buildings, which Margaret had quietly dismantled between April and May. Burning what could be burned, burying what could be buried, scattering the evidence across the property. The buyers had no interest in the compound. They wanted only the productive farmland. Margaret relocated to Alabama to a small property near Mobile and disappeared from public record. The last confirmed sighting of her was in 1863 when a neighbor reported seeing an enormously obese woman living alone in a run-down house on the outskirts of Mobile. After that, nothing. She may have died during the war years or relocated further west or simply vanished into the chaos of a collapsing Confederacy. No death certificate was ever filed. No grave was ever identified. Margaret Dunor simply ceased to exist in any official record after 1863. Thomas, the boy at the center of Margaret's experiment, had a different fate. When the compound was closed in January 1860, he had been placed under court protection. Robert Chen, feeling personally responsible for Thomas's welfare, arranged for him to be housed temporarily with a Quaker family in Savannah, who opposed slavery and agreed to care for him during the legal proceedings. When the war started and Margaret's case was postponed, Thomas remained with this family. The Quakers, a couple named Daniel and Abigail Hargrove, treated Thomas with genuine kindness, the first he had experienced since being sold at age 11. They continued his education, taught him practical skills, and most importantly, treated him as a human being rather than a specimen. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, Thomas was legally free. Though the practicalities of freedom for a 17-year-old albino boy in the middle of a war zone were complicated, Thomas remained with the Harrove family through the war and Reconstruction. He learned carpentry and became skilled enough to support himself. In 1869, at age 23, he married a free woman of color named Rebecca Williams, and they had 3 children together. None of the children showed albinism. All were healthy and lived to adulthood. Thomas worked as a carpenter in Savannah for over 30 years, living a quiet life and rarely speaking about his years at Belmont except to his wife, who he trusted completely. Robert Chen continued his medical career, but the experience at Belmont changed him fundamentally. He abandoned his research into anatomical variation and instead focused on public health, working to improve medical care for poor communities in Atlanta. He maintained correspondence with Thomas for over 20 years, and in his private journals, he wrote extensively about the ethical responsibilities of physicians and the dangers of scientific rationalization for cruelty. He died in 1892 at age 57. Still haunted by what he had seen in that compound. Harrison Pembroke never recovered from his guilt over participating in Margaret's experiments. He continued practicing medicine in Charleston, but he drank heavily and his mental health deteriorated. In 1867, he committed suicide by overdose of laudanum, leaving behind a note that referenced unforgivable sins committed in the name of science. His medical notes from Belmont, which had been entered as evidence in Margaret's case, were supposed to be sealed by the court, but were never returned to the court records. They disappeared sometime during the chaos of war and Reconstruction. Augustus, the driver who had finally broken silence and provided testimony that started the investigation, lived until 1879. He remained in Chatham County after the war, working as a freight driver. He was known for being quiet and sad, rarely smiling, as if he carried weight that never lightened. He died at approximately 60 years old. His grave marked with a simple stone that gave no hint of the courage it had taken for him to speak up against Margaret Dunor. As for the 8 people removed from the compound in January 1860, their fates varied. Some died during the war years. Some disappeared into the chaos of Reconstruction. At least 2, including Hannah, remained in the Savannah area and lived into the 1870s. Hannah never married and had no children. She worked as a heiress and lived alone. Known in her neighborhood as a woman who seemed perpetually sad but was kind to children. She died in 1876, and at her request she was buried under her real name, Hannah Freeman, in a cemetery for free blacks in Savannah. Her gravestone, which still exists, bears the inscription. She survived what should have killed her. The property where Belmont stood changed hands multiple times between 1861 and 1959. The main house burned in 1883 because unknown. The land was used for various purposes, farming, timber harvesting, briefly as a hunting preserve. The compound area deep in the pine forest was largely forgotten. Trees grew over the cleared areas. The cemetery, with its wooden stakes long rotted away, became indistinguishable from surrounding forest floor. In 1959, the state of Georgia approved construction of a new highway that would cut through the former Belmont property. During initial surveying in March 1959, construction workers discovered the foundation of one of the compound buildings. Inside a sealed cavity in the foundation wall, they found a leather-bound journal, remarkably well preserved due to being completely sealed away from moisture and air. The journal was one of Margaret Dunor's records from the Purification Project. It had been hidden rather than burned, possibly as insurance or perhaps simply overlooked in Margaret's hasty destruction of evidence in 1861. The journal covered the years 1855 through 1859 and contained detailed documentation of Thomas's acquisition, education, and eventual use in breeding experiments. It included measurements, observations, predictions, and chillingly clinical descriptions of the forced pairings. The construction workers who found the journal brought it to the County Historical Society. Uncertain what they had discovered, the Historical Society staff who first read it were horrified. They contacted state authorities, and the journal was eventually turned over to the Georgia State Archives. A brief investigation was conducted comparing the journal's contents against other historical records, census data, and court documents from the 1860 case against Margaret Dunor. The investigation confirmed that everything in the journal appeared to be authentic. The dates matched known events. The names referenced in the journal matched names from the court records. Physical descriptions of the compound matched the foundation remains being uncovered by highway construction. But the investigation also revealed something disturbing. There had been a systematic effort to suppress information about the Belmont case even after the war. Court records from Margaret's 1860 prosecution had been partially destroyed supposedly during the war, though some documents seem to have been removed deliberately rather than lost to military action. Newspaper archives from Savannah in 1860 contained almost nothing about the case despite it involving sensational allegations against a wealthy plantation owner. It appeared that even after Margaret fled, her family's wealth and influence had been used to minimize public knowledge of what happened. The Georgia State Archives classified the journal as a historically significant document, but restricted public access to it for 10 years until 1969, citing concerns about privacy and the sensitive nature of the content. When it was finally made available to researchers in 1969, it attracted attention from historians studying slavery, medical ethics, and eugenics in antebellum America. Several academic papers were published analyzing Margaret's experiment as an example of how eugenic thinking manifested in the antebellum South. The case became a teaching example in medical ethics courses, illustrating the dangers of scientific rationalization for cruelty. But mainstream history chose to look away. The story of Belmont was too disturbing, too tangled, too uncomfortable to fit neatly into the romanticized image of antebellum Georgia. Thomas's descendants, many of whom still lived in the Savannah area, first learned of the journal's discovery through newspaper reports in 1969. By then, Thomas had been gone for nearly 7 decades. He had died in 1902 at the age of 56, having lived long enough to see his children grow and his grandchildren born. Before his death, he had told his wife Rebecca much of what he endured at Belmont. She, in turn, had passed fragments of that truth to their children, though carefully, shielding them from the worst of it. When the journal became public, those children were now grandparents themselves, in their 50s and 60s. And for the first time, they understood the full scope of what their grandfather had survived. The family quietly debated whether to acknowledge their connection to the case. But in the end, they chose silence. They were respected members of the Savannah community, people who had built stable, successful lives despite the racial barriers of the Jim Crow South. Public association with such a horrific chapter of history, they feared, might invite scrutiny or worse. So they kept their knowledge within the family. The world moved on. The highway construction continued. Archaeologists documented the remains of the compound's foundations before the bulldozers arrived. The ground was turned over, layer by layer, revealing a grim record of human suffering. The burial site, once hidden beneath centuries of soil, lay directly in the path of the new road. It was excavated with care. In the end, the remains of 61 individuals were recovered, men, women, and children, from infants to the elderly. All were reinterred in a single grave in a Savannah cemetery, marked by a simple stone that reads, "In memory of those who suffered at Belmont Plantation, 1842-1860. May they rest in peace and never be forgotten." The story of Margaret Dunor forces us to confront a painful truth: how easily the language of science can be twisted to justify cruelty, how law and authority can become instruments of oppression, how entire institutions can fail to protect the powerless. Margaret's experiments were not a bizarre exception. They were the logical extreme of a worldview accepted by her society. A world that treated human beings as property, that saw reproduction as a resource to be managed, and that valued progress over humanity itself. What set her apart was not her ideas, but the terrifying precision with which she pursued them, until history at last caught her shadow. So what do you think? Did Margaret Dunor escape justice? Or did her guilt follow her into whatever fate awaited her after 1863? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this story compelling, subscribe to Vintage Truths, where we uncover the hidden, haunted realities buried beneath America's past. Don't forget to hit the notification bell and share this video with someone who appreciates the darker side of history. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the most terrifying horrors are the ones that truly happened. See you in the next video.